right. Good morning, everyone. Happy Thursday, and we will start by reviewing the weekly question, perhaps, depending on, if I can find the right button, huh? Also, just gentle reminders when you're doing the weekly question, they're really designed for you to find the answer in the textbook. So feel free, yes, to use the textbook. That's what the intention is. And since I'm going to tell you page numbers to use, that'll be helpful, I think. And we're going to go over stuff in class. So also specific examples. I know we're 2/3 of the way through the class, but there's still people writing stuff that, clearly is straight from some site on Google. A lot of you like history.com. It's not bad, but textbook. I mean, really, the questions are designed to use the textbook plus index, or the page numbers I tell you, but use specific examples and, don't just say, well, we were racist, therefore we had slavery. So specific examples. Some of you still are writing answers that are about the same length as the question. And if your answer is not longer than the question, you are probably not going to get a grade you like. So, sorry. All right, let's look at the weekly question. See if we can find it. There it is. Number 12. And I graded one of these already, and somebody was talking about how Theodore Weld was married to a white woman. He was. He's also a white guy. So, I mean, your statement was true, but I think the implication was that he was black. He was not black. You may have, because I looked at one of the sources that it seemed like whoever wrote that used. And there was a story in there about how when he was a kid, he went to a school where there was one black kid and everybody ostracized him, but he went and befriended him. And I don't know if somehow you read that story and thought, oh, he was the black guy. He's a really, a white guy. He was the head of, I think it was Yale Theological Seminary, but he was a theology professor at a seminary. And that's kind of how he got in touch with so many different people. And he taught that slavery was a sin, which is why there's this discussion of the sinfulness of slavery. And again, I know it's a history class, so we're not talking, sin and for personal purposes. We're just talking about how this changes the argument why slavery needs to end. And especially in a country that embraces Christianity, if you can convince the general public that something the country has as a policy is sinful, it's an effective strategy. And don't misread that. I'm not saying that Theodore Weld sat down one day and said, oh, what's going to be my strategy today? He truly believed that slavery was a sin. That was not a strategy for him. I don't mean it in that way. But for historical analysis purposes, when we look at somebody declaring something a sin and the general public accepting that declaration, intentional or not, it kind of becomes a strategy. Oh, crud. Somebody just came in and I didn't notice who it was. So, it was Daniel. All right, Daniel, gotcha. So, pages 450 to 454. So make sure that or 456, make sure that you look at that section. And in particular, let's see where it talks about Weld. Sorry, the lighting is a little off in my house today. I should have been more prepared. It also talks, excuse me, about how different factions develop within the slavery abolition movement, and how some of those factions thought women should lead more, women should lead less, which is, a little complicated, I suppose. Garrison, abolition message, there it is, Weld. So Weld is the last couple of pages of that discussion. So to what extent was Weld's argument about the sinfulness of slavery not only radical, but necessary for the popularization of immediate abolition? So I think if I'm you, when I answer this question, I probably start off with a little intro about who Theodore Weld was. One of the things that you guys do a little more consistently than I would like is you say like Theodore Weld thought this, but you don't tell me who Theodore Weld was. So give me some evidence that you figured out who he was. And you know, you don't have to do a whole big search about who he was, but just mention that he was a minister, that he was a theologian, that he taught at a seminary, and you can mention that he wrote something as well. There's quotes in here from that he used, or that he said, excuse me. And then on 455, there's a discussion of the strategy of moral suasion, which kind of goes along with William Lloyd Garrison as well. So I started with an intro about Theodore Weld, who he was, and what he did for a living. And then I would maybe talk about the different factions within the abolitionist group, the people who wanted colonization, the people who wanted gradual emancipation, and the people who wanted immediate abolition, and just make a very brief explanation of those things, just say what they are, and maybe mention if there are any famous people who favored those ideas. And there won't be for very long that favor anything but immediate abolition. And then when you talk about immediate abolition, talk about why they thought it was sinful and who agreed with Weld, and how that, because so many people in the movement agreed with Weld, that really leads to the idea that slavery needs to end immediately. So, ooh, and you could go to 458 on this as well. I probably should have said that. So your reading section is pretty short on this, 450 to 458, but be sure that you look over that before you answer the question, and then talk about who Theodore Weld was, what the different philosophies on abolition were, and how they started to spread it because they thought slavery was sinful. So, and you know, at some point in that discussion, talk about how persuading people that slavery was sinful really makes that connection to immediate abolition, because if something sins, you know, if you decide something in your life is wrong, sinful, however you want to define it, you usually don't say like, that's really wrong, but I'm going to do that just a little while longer. You know, so if you decide something's wrong, you stop it in your own life, and if it's really wrong, you want everyone else to stop it as well. So that's, I mean, that's a really basic idea behind this, but you know, it works. So, but in your answer, to get that specific stuff in there, tell me who Weld was, tell me the different ideas of abolition, and then tell me who joined this group of people who favored immediate abolition. If you're wondering how long your answer should be, typically the answers that are good are at least a page long, because you have to give specific examples. And I'm going to say it again, because several of you who are on right now keep doing this. If your answer is a paragraph, if it's about the length of the question, your answer is too short. And don't tell me, but it's really good. No, it's not. There aren't any specific examples, okay? Specific examples, always important in a history class. Yeah, truly. All right, not trying to be rude, just trying to tell you. And I do write this stuff in the comments. I'm just not sure you always see it. All right, time to look at the notes. So pretty much everything we're going to talk about, except for the feminist section, is going to be hopefully stuff that will help you just a little bit in your answer. All right, so we talked about all the reform stuff last time, you know, everything from my favorite reform, prohibition, to asylum and prison reform, public school reform. I don't think we talked about that as much, but the push for a common school movement, the idea that everyone should have the opportunity, get a basic education, public free education, that sort of thing. And that picks up more in the North and the South. I think somebody emailed and said, why did the South not like education? Why did they not want one? I don't know if the South dislikes education. They don't have a tax base to support it because they don't have as many cities, they don't have as much industry. And typically people tax either on imports and exports, sometimes sales tax, that sort of thing. During this era, there's no income tax. So to raise money, you probably have to sell stuff that's not cotton. So the South doesn't create as much tax revenue locally, so they don't have the money to fund schools. So people go to private school in the South if they go, and most people don't go. All right. The Second Great Awakening also makes people believe that, or leads people to the conclusion that slavery needs to end, and it needs to end right away. So, as I mentioned to you, I really think you should mention the ideas of colonization and gradual emancipation in part of your kind of warm up to your answer for this week. So, colonization is the idea that slaves should be freed, but they should be sent to a slave colony in Africa. And during this era, a group of people actually purchased some land to create. It was actually a little bit before, it was in the Monroe presidency, and they called the place Liberia, and the capital was Monrovia, which might help you remember. It was during the Monroe era. That's why I remember. Um, and their thought was slaves need to be freed, but blacks and whites probably can't peacefully coexist. So we should ship them somewhere to Africa. And since Monrovia is, or excuse me, Liberia is really kind of a made up country. So they purchased some land, and there are several different groups who were fighting over that land. They really have introduced a new population of people into a land where there's essentially a civil war going on. So it's maybe not the most peaceful place to go. However, if you were a slave and somebody said, hey, I'll free you and send you to Monrovia, to Liberia, excuse me, you might go. I mean, because being a slave, clearly uncool. Now, the problem, of course, is you're not going to be anywhere near your family. Excuse me, and you won't be visiting because people can travel back and forth to visit very often, and yeah, so not very many people went. The thought also with colonization is that people would be willing to free their slaves because they noticed that it was wrong, slavery, and so they would allow their slaves to leave or send their slaves over to Liberia. That didn't happen. People who owned slaves in the South didn't someday say, you know what, the slavery thing really is bad. I think I will fund my slaves' trip to Africa so they can live in this new country. That just didn't happen. Okay, so yeah, all right. So colonization, famous people who thought colonization might be an okay idea. And then your book, of course, on page 450 starts to talk about the American Colonization Society, which created Liberia. It says prominent political leaders of the Jackson era supported colonization, including Henry Clay, John Marshall, that would be that Supreme Court justice we mentioned from time to time, and Andrew Jackson. Even briefly, the book doesn't mention this, but even briefly, Abraham Lincoln thought that it wouldn't be a terrible idea, but he's going to change his mind about it. Now, the premise behind the idea that colonization is a good idea is that the United States is meant for white people. Because these, most of the people who thought this also thought it was good to send Native Americans to reservations west of the Mississippi River. So the fundamental idea behind this thought is that white people should possess the land from at least the East Coast to the Mississippi River. They'll broaden that as time goes along. And everybody else certainly deserves a place to live, just not that place. So kind of a racist, more than kind of a racist assumption behind that. So then the next section of the book talks about how African Americans felt about that. And yeah, American Colonization Society forms about 3,000, let's see, it says early in 1817, 3,000 blacks assembled in Philadelphia um, for their first, let's see, for the first National Black Convention. Resolution insisted that blacks were Americans entitled to the same freedoms enjoyed by whites. So this is going to immediately start a backlash from free blacks. And also, and people will also talk about how colonization would give Black Christians the opportunity to spread Christianity in Africa, which is sort of a funny thought because Christianity really starts in the Middle East, which is kind of Northern Africa, and certainly spread, but okay. All right. So abolition isn't necessarily the most prominent, popular. I'm sorry, colonization isn't the most prominent popular idea. And I guess I could fairly say that abolition wasn't necessarily the most popular idea in the South. I think we could fairly say that, except for with the Grimke sisters, of course. All right. Excuse me for 1 second. Excuse me. Okay. I really did lose my place there, didn't I? So colonization, I feel like we're done with that. Okay. The book will kind of briefly talk about gradual abolition as well. They'll give an example or two of how gradual abolition works, or gradual abolition. And the idea behind gradual abolition was that we wanted to give slave owners the chance to adjust to the idea of not having slaves. So gradual abolition really not, there aren't any slaves who are a fan of that idea. Now, this is how most northern states achieve abolition, and they do this really fairly early, in the early 1800s up through about the 1820s. Excuse me. Goodness, so sorry. I think allergies, but there's nobody that thinks gradual emancipation is a good idea who had ever been a slave. So the new reformers, the people who are really strongly into immediate abolition, really reject the idea of gradual emancipation. Talks a little bit about this on 452 and reasons that they rejected the idea. And it also mentions, I think, in Connecticut where they do this, but most states who did gradual abolition said by the year 1820, all the slaves will be free in the state, or by the time your slave is 25, you have to free them. And then, no, at that point also, once that law is passed, you can't enslave any new people. So eventually all the slaves were freed, and this gave the owner a chance to adjust. Nobody sees that as terribly moral or ethical. That's really more of an economic arrangement, which really doesn't address the moral or ethical ideas. So as that reform progressed, it became clear that an immediate wrong needed an immediate solution. All of the major abolitionists of this era, Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, Sojourner Truth, etc. And Sojourner Truth was freed through gradual abolition, and also had to kind of decide which of her, she had like 9 or 10 kids, which of her 9 or 10 kids she would purchase to free them, and the rest of them she had to let them wait until they achieve that age of emancipation, which apparently some of them had some frustration about, but choose it a spot, I suppose. So nobody thought gradual emancipation was a good idea. Frederick Douglass achieved his emancipation by escaping slavery. He ran away and then eventually sent money back to pay for himself. Frederick Douglass is an interestingly bold fellow. But they all favor immediate emancipation. And if slavery is a sin, then it needs to stop immediately. So And part of this is that philosophy that is developed in the ideas of Theodore Weld. Um, let's see. So it mentions that Weld was a convert of Charles Finney, who is an evangelical preacher of the Second Great Awakening, who's super famous. If you go to an evangelical church, you hear about Charles Finney all the time. I know the church I attend, he comes up because he's like a really excited, emotional sort of preacher. And the quote that's in your book from Weld, in discussing the subject of slavery, I've always presented it as a preeminently moral question arresting the conscience of the nation. Excuse me. As a question of politics and national economy, I have passed it with scarce a look or a word. Um, but what he's going to end up discussing, that may not be the most exciting quote that they could have taken, but he's saying that, you know, at a certain point, we can't just say that slavery is an institution that needs to be ended. It is a preeminently moral question. Is slavery right or wrong? So if you decide something is wrong, which it's pretty hard in his opinion to look at slavery and think that it's not wrong, he says the only proper response to sin is to end it. And, you know, again, because he has a large audience, because he's a professor, that sort of stuff, he is going to be somebody whose opinion is going to spread throughout religious circles. And because we're in the middle of a religious revival, that's going to have a pretty big impact. And then the section on the next page where it talks about slavery and moral suasion. It really shows that with the Liberator and after Nat Turner's rebellion, because Nat Turner's rebellion is pretty rough, and you know, people die, that sort of thing, and it's pretty bloody. People sometimes look at that and they think, well, I'm a pacifist, especially people who have that kind of Quaker background or Mennonite background. They go, I'm a pacifist, but I'm not willing to fight to end slavery because, you know, fighting goes against pacifism. But the argument is going to be that slave owners are not going to just automatically give up their slaves, and that it may take a different sort of crusade to end this kind of evil. So there's a lot of, I think there's a lot of interesting discussion in that section that will really help you come to conclusions about why the idea that slavery is sinful and needs an immediate end really pushes people away from the idea of colonization and away from the idea of gradual emancipation. Okay, all right. But I promise you, if you look at those pages, 950, my goodness, there's not even 900 pages, 450 to 458 really help you with the question over this chapter. Okay, Frederick Douglass, you know him from the narrative of the life of, and the reason that he wrote that book was to show people that slavery wasn't a benign institution, that it wasn't paternalistic, that people didn't treat their slaves well, from his own personal experiences. And you'll see lots of slave narratives during this time period. His is probably the most developed and most famous. He writes a book about it. And the book is a nice length so that people were willing to read it. That's also why I suggest it to you as your book review, because it's a nice length. If you read that book, sometimes people are frustrated because he doesn't talk specifically about how he escaped. But the reason he doesn't do that is because slavery is still illegal and people are still escaping slavery. So he doesn't want to give the details because he doesn't want to help get other people caught, if that makes sense. I know it probably does, doesn't it? Okay. William Lloyd Garrison writes a newspaper called The Liberator. I guess it's essentially a magazine. And the whole purpose of that is to persuade people and organize people to end slavery. Goodness, sorry. Wow. And let's see, where were we? William Lloyd Garrison. Sojourner Truth was the woman who was emancipated by gradual emancipation in New York. She lived with a family, a Dutch family. So her English, she spoke English and Dutch, and her English had sort of a Dutch accent. So people were really, they had like a speaking circuit of former slaves, and she was on that circuit along with Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass is more famous in a lot of ways, but Sojourner Truth was not literate. She didn't read or write, and she didn't really see a need to read or write. Frederick Douglass was sure that reading and writing was the path to freedom. So he really linked education and freedom. Sojourner Truth did not. And so honestly, those two didn't really always get along, because Douglass thought that Sojourner Truth, Isabella something, but she took a new name when she gained her freedom. So Sojourner Truth, uh, she just didn't see that as essential. So Frederick Douglass thought that she was downplaying the importance of education. So they didn't hang out very much. They didn't get along, but they're both effective spokespersons. Sometimes people would go see Sojourner Truth because she was sort of a curiosity as well, because she's really big. She's like 6 feet tall in an era where most women were probably closer to 5 feet tall. You know, in this era, people were smaller because nutrition wasn't as good, that sort of thing. So statistics usually suggest the average guy was about 5'6", and the average woman's about 5 feet tall. So Sojourner Truth's about 6 feet tall. And people even, and she had a really deep voice and had that peculiar accent. So there were times that people suggested that she wasn't really a woman, and she did go to some unusual extremes one time after speaking press conference, essentially to sort of suggest to them that she was a woman. But she favors immediate emancipation as well. And there's lots of other people. The book talks about the Tappan brothers, who are these wealthy folks. If you were old like me, you would remember Tappan Appliances. Those are the guys that founded that corporation. So they funded a big part of the abolition movement. And, you know, all of this has to have money for this to work. So it's really interesting because it's sort of like, I don't want to say a business, but maybe a little more like an enterprise in that era. So there's got to be a fundraising wing. There's got to be a public speaking wing. There's got to be a writing wing, that kind of stuff. And the book will also talk about the Grimke sisters, who are Quakers and abolitionists, and their father owns a plantation in South Carolina. So he's not overly impressed by, that's an understatement, by their push for abolition. The book will also mention, let's see, slavery is a sin that needs to be stopped immediately. After his presidency, John Quincy Adams probably does more important stuff before his presidency and after his presidency, which I think is kind of interesting. I don't know that we see that so much in the modern era, although curiously, old George Bush, the one who passed away a year or two ago, and Bill Clinton worked together on lots of projects overseas. Certainly Jimmy Carter is pretty well known for his post-presidential activism. I don't know if it's definitely too soon for us to know if Donald Trump is going to have a post-presidential activism in society. I think probably to a certain extent. Barack Obama does, and certainly speaks out on certain issues. But what John Quincy Adams did is he ran for Congress, which is a weird thing to do, and gets elected in Massachusetts. And the Congress had passed something called the gag rule, which meant that any time an issue of slavery came up, that it was automatically tabled and there could be no discussion of it. So it was really a technique to limit any sort of debate about issues related to slavery. And their goal in Congress was really just to stop the debate altogether. And if you stop the debate, then you're definitely not going to end it, because you would need a majority of people to just vote yes or no without discussion. And that's never going to happen. So if you have a gag rule on a certain issue, it means that no laws will ever be passed about that issue. And I assume that you've noticed that if something is in blue and it's underlined, that there's a link to that. And when I put links in, I usually tried, I'm assuming they all still work. I haven't looked at them for probably a year. But when I put the links in, I tried to link them to more reliable sources, i.e. not Wikipedia. Yeah, that's what I'm saying, or Fred's blog about slavery. So, all right. So if you click on those links, you might get more information from a fairly reliable source. But the gag rules are banned on discussions of bills pertaining to slavery in the House of Representatives, which means nothing related to slavery passes. So the rules on slavery are going to stay with Missouri Compromise rules. Everything above 3630 is free, everything below is slave, and never to be discussed again. And then there's a Supreme Court case regarding a group of slaves who were captured on a ship called the Amistad. And Amistad, I think, means friendship, or yes, I'm pretty sure. Well, I know it does. But this ship gets captured, and it's a slave ship. And at this point, the slave trade is illegal. There's no way around that. The slave trade is illegal, but the ship gets captured, and this is a Spanish slavery ship. And sorry, I was looking to see where in the book it talks about the Amistad, so you may have to peek in your index, and I may do that for you here in a sec, but I also may not. So the Amistad gets captured, and then what had happened, there was a mutiny on the ship. At some point, the slaves got control of the ship, and they threw most of the crew overboard except for the captain and the navigator. Good choice on the navigator. And when they said, take us back to Africa where we came from, and so they took them to the United States. When they landed on the East Coast, they argued, the two Spanish guys said what had happened is that these guys had killed everyone and that they should be charged with murder. So they hold all the slaves in prison, and there's they a lawyer comes to visit them. Nobody truly really speaks the language that they speak, the dialect, or the language that they speak. So they find a slave that works on the docks who knows some of what they're saying. He goes down and explains to them from the slave's perspective what happens. And eventually they petition that they, because they had not, they shouldn't have never have been captured, that they had a right to defend themselves, they had the right of freedom, that sort of thing, and that they should be allowed to return to their native country rather than be arrested. They ask for a hearing that eventually gets them to the Supreme Court, and they are represented in the Supreme Court by John Quincy Adams, who argues that they have the right to self-defense, to freedom, and that they should be returned home at the expense of the United States government, which doesn't sound like it's going to be a winning argument, except it is. So then they end up being returned home to Sierra Leone at the expense of the United States government, which is a really interesting situation, because apparently the Supreme Court thinks that if you're not born in the United States and you're Black, you have a right to some sort of freedom. So kind of interesting. It's not going to be the basis of anybody arguing, that they also deserve freedom even though they're born in the United States, because there's not going to be a precedent set that way. But it is kind of curious that the United States government, the United States government would pay for the trip back to Africa, but it's, because the Supreme Court said that's what needed to be done. It wasn't, the president agreed or Congress agreed. They just happened to follow that ruling of the Supreme Court. We've already mentioned that Andrew Jackson doesn't always follow the rulings of the Supreme Court. We have mentioned that. All right. And John Quincy Adams is also going to argue for 20 years to end the gag rule, which eventually does happen And then there's open discussion of slavery again, which allows for discussion of emancipation and really kind of leads to that continuing conflict between the North and the South that maybe had briefly gone away. Gag rule ends in 1844. So the book talks about the gag rule on 461, if you wanted to look there. The book also talks in that section about how anti-abolitionist sentiment was becoming more violent in some instances, about how people are destroying abolitionist literature, or about how an editor of an abolitionist newsletter named Elijah Lovejoy is going to be assassinated by neighbors, by people in the neighboring community. How there are certainly mobs in certain countries that burn down meeting places for abolitionist groups. So you're starting to see a fairly violent, excuse me, so sorry, a fairly violent reaction to the discussion of abolition during this era. So what you should know from that is that the disagreements between people who think it's okay to have slaves and people who don't are becoming really intense. Yeah. And so that peace that was supposed to be created by the Missouri Compromise in 1820, where now we have a line, everything above it is free, everything below it is slave, no, that's not going to work. All right. Okay, so we have John Quincy Adams, Gag Rule, Amistad, and Sierra Leone. All right. Peeking in my book here. So then the next section is going to have a discussion of women's rights. And the women's rights movement develops during this time period in a new and different sort of way. I think the most famous event of this movement is the Seneca Falls Convention, which is mentioned here and mentioned more in your textbook. And there's also going to be different factions within the women's rights movement. And there's going to be arguments between those groups that come from or extend to the abolition movement. Almost everybody involved in the women's rights movement also is involved in the abolition movement. And you see a lot of leadership in both that from women. And because this tends to be, at least the abolition part of this movement tends to be a religious movement, there are lots of religious men who don't think that women should be in charge of public meetings, that sort of thing. So they're going to object to women's involvement in abolition. And they're also going to think that women really should not want equal rights because that would ruin the sphere of domesticity, or the idea of the cult of domesticity, where women need to stay moral and pure and out of worldly activities where they could be corrupted. And worldly activities might even include petitioning for the end of slavery. So it's kind of an interesting thought. And the two factions that develop are really just the most prominent faction of the women's rights movement, which includes Susan B. Anthony, Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Grimke sisters, and the other side, which includes Catherine Beecher and a bunch of dudes. Catherine Beecher really thought and wrote quite a bit that women had the most opportunity to influence society by staying home and by being good wives and mothers and teachers, essentially. And she helped start the female seminary movement, which really was just a college for women to help them become better wives and mothers, that sort of thing. Which is funny to think that you would go to college for that. Catherine Beecher herself was neither a wife nor a mother, and she made a career of writing and teaching about how to be a good wife and a mother. And I always thought that was super ironic and interesting because she advocated for something she really apparently did not want for herself, and really seemed to enjoy the freedom that allowed her to move around the country and earn money, that sort of thing. Um, so, all right. Let's see. Catherine Beecher. I can't remember what the name of the book she wrote was. And her sister also likes to write. Her sister is Harriet Beecher Stowe, and she's the one who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. But Catherine Beecher, when she writes about how to be a good wife and mother, what's moderately interesting about that as well is she talks about education, about how it's important for women to have a basic level of education because they're the first and most important teachers to their children, and they're also the moral instructors. But she also thought that you need to cook healthy food, that you needed to exercise, that nutrition mattered, that pedagogy, how you teach people, mattered. But she really thought women should not vote or participate in politics. However, the larger group of people that we would consider feminists were very involved in politics, that sort of stuff. They wrote something called the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments at the Seneca Falls Convention, which really patterned itself after the Declaration of Independence. And this is also the beginning of the movement for the push for women to get the right to vote, women's suffrage. Part of the reason that the women had the Seneca Falls Convention is that they had gone to a World Anti-Slavery Convention in 1840 that was held in London, and they weren't allowed to participate because they were women. So they thought, well, maybe it's time for women's rights as well. And the book does a really good job of chronicling, who was involved, who the Grimke sisters were, what they wrote, what they thought, the back and forth between this movement and Catherine Beecher, because they all knew each other, of course. How Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott organized the Seneca Falls Convention, how that's led by women. Some men attended. Frederick Douglass is always big on women's rights. But they talk about how this is kind of the beginning of what we think of as the feminist movement proper. And then there'll be an excerpt from the Declaration of Sentiments, which is patterned after the Declaration of Independence. And instead of the list of complaints about George III, which you saw in the Declaration of Independence, you're going to see the list of complaints about men. Yeah, and if you go like, well, that's sexist, well, of course it is. It's a women's rights convention, and they're going to argue that men have prevented women from having rights. So yeah, it is going to be by its nature sexist. And then they will also compare being a woman to being a slave, and that's part of the reason that you'll see such crossover between the women's rights movement and the abolition movement. Now, it's going to create an interesting issue when the abolition movement is successful, but the women's rights movement, not so much. And the chapter will end with a discussion of arguments within the abolition community over women's participation, whether women are wholesome and pure and should participate, or whether women are really trying to destroy male leadership roles by adapting or adopting leadership roles within these causes. And some of the Christians within this movement are extremely conservative, so they just don't like the idea of women leading movements, that sort of thing. And most of the people who, sorry for the yawn, were part of the abolition movement are not as concerned about women's participation, so much so that they want to leave the movement. But because the Tappan brothers really are concerned about it and they're multimillionaires, a lot of the funding is going to kind of go away. But by this point, and we're talking 1840s, they've gained enough fame and notoriety and are producing newsletters that it doesn't necessarily harm the movement. It just sort of splits the movement a little bit, but the movement will reform after the Whig Party falls apart. And as we move forward, into the last few chapters of the book, you'll see the Whig Party fall apart. You'll see the Republican Party form, and the Republican Party forms really on the issue of slavery. I mean, it's not well, it is, yeah. It's because the Whig Party is going to be pro-slavery and anti-slavery, and the anti-slavery Whigs form the Republican Party. And you go like, didn't we have the Republican Party before? Yes, we did. But the new Republican Party, which is the eventual just Republican Party, the main issue, their main concern is slavery. All right. I'm going to stop for a second, check the roll, see if you have any questions. You guys have been notoriously quiet today, so I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.